Well, hello. My name's Louise Savage of Louise Savage Muses. Welcome back if you've viewed my channel before, and you're very welcome if we've never met. Um, so I thought today it's the run up to the summer holidays, and I'm a teacher, so you know those 5-6 weeks feature quite heavily in my life, and have done obviously since I was a child, and I was sort of thinking about the sorts of books that I used to really look forward to reading over the summer. And I suppose when I was about, well, I know actually because I've got it written down in here. When I was 14, my mum gave me this book, The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, and I know that because inside I've written in my best handwriting. Oh, there's too much glare on there. I don't know if you can see. Louise E. Savage, very important that E. August 79. So I suspect this was probably bought for me while we were on holiday somewhere. And it's The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. And it was through reading this novel that I developed my passion for literature and also, you know, at the time, that the subsequent 3 or 4 years, I became really obsessed with reading classic sort of Victorian, European, I'm afraid, literature. And it was this book that kick-started it, and I absolutely devoured it. Now, it's known as perhaps the first detective story in Western literature. It's unusual in that it's epistolary, so there are letters, there's all sorts of other sorts of evidence, and you are trying to work out as you read the case of the missing moonstone. So the moonstone is this massive diamond which is given to Rachel, I can't remember her surname, this young woman on her 18th birthday, and she wears it to her 18th birthday party, and it is stolen. Now the moonstone, the diamond, has been acquired by, I think it's her uncle, who's a bit of a shady character, before his death, and he's bequeathed it to his niece. And there are 3 Hindu priests who are intent on recovering the diamond because it has religious significance and it's extremely valuable as well. And obviously, you know, culturally, it should belong in India. So yeah, and so therefore this whole trail of adventure kind of begins, and it's really creepy and just hypnotically written. I mean, a lot of the scenes in it I've still got stuck in my head from when I read it when I was 14, and that's well over 40 years ago, which, you know, if that's not testament to a novel, I don't quite know what is. I think I'd find it a little bit slow to get into now if I started reading it again, but I would certainly want to be patient and you know, wait until it will hook you quite quickly. And the descriptions of the characters are amazing. I mean, the whole thing, the setting, the pace of the plot. Yeah, really thoroughly enjoyed it, and I've gone on to read lots of other Wilkie Collins novels that I thoroughly enjoy. So that was the first recommendation. Secondly, I then moved on, I think, to Thomas Hardy, and became very entrapped in his novels, and my goodness, can he tell a good yarn. I don't hear people talking about him very much these days, but certainly, again, he was responsible for switching me on to a lot of fiction. And I think I just love the twists and turns of his plot, and if you like a good tragedy, there's usually, yeah, it's a bit like Shakespeare, there's usually a heap of corpses by the end, or certainly a whole load of disasters. Controversially, I'm not a massive fan of Tess of the D'Urbervilles. I find Tess and particularly Angel Clare, one of the male protagonists, if he's even that, I just find his character very wet, I'm afraid, which is probably a bit shallow of me, but I enjoyed reading it when I was younger, but it doesn't grab me in the way some of his other novels do. So I've got quite a few sat here of Hardy's. The first one is The Mayor of Casterbridge. What a rollicking tale, and it's just, you know, it's one of the best openings of a novel, I think, ever, the opening chapter or two. because Michael Henchard is a drunk, and he gets incredibly drunk. He's an agricultural worker. He's itinerant. He's moving around from place to place with his wife and his baby daughter Elizabeth Jane, and they arrive at this tent where, you know, it's a fair so that you can get employment and so on. And he goes into the tent. I think it's called Homity, what they're drinking. I can't remember. And he gets really drunk. And in a fit of drunkenness, he decides that he's going to auction off his wife and child. And he sells them to a sailor who seems to be a pretty decent character. Anyway, Henchard wakes up the following morning full of remorse, probably with a banging hangover, and decides that he's done something terribly wrong. He wants to make amends, but he can't track them down. And he hears rumours that they've gone to America, set sail for America, and so his attempts to find them are thwarted, and he settles in a place called Casterbridge. And then fast forward 18 years when Elizabeth Jane obviously is no longer a baby but is eligible for marriage, and the remainder of the tale is picked up there. And it's just, yeah, I just love his, you know, the way there's a real, it's old-fashioned, very leisurely storytelling, and I think that's why I associate these books. I know I didn't read them all in the summer, that would be wrong to say that. But there is something lovely about, and I think, you know, you're kind of in the countryside as well. These novels are all set in sort of Dorsetshire, or Wessex, as Hardy called it. So I think there's a kind of summer feel, lots of descriptions of getting in the hay, and, you know, there's also lots of wintry stuff going on as well. But I loved that, and I think it would be a really good one if you haven't read Thomas Hardy before. The other one I would recommend highly, if I hadn't read any Thomas Hardy before, and again, look how dated that is. That was my copy of Far from the Madding Crowd from when I was younger. Another Thomas Hardy, and again, it's a beautiful story, and there's so much action in these stories as well as inaction, and I just think he gets the balance really right. I'd love to have been sat by the fireside with him telling me stories, although I think he was a little bit of an unusual character. Anyway, Far from the Madding Crowd tells the story of a woman with a wonderful name, Bathsheba Everdeen, and she encounters Gabriel Oak. I think she saves his life, can't quite remember. And he's a shepherd, and he falls for her, but their paths don't cross for some years, and in the meantime she inherits a farm. And so she's you know, a woman in a man's world. She's very isolated in many ways and has to try to retain her power and authority, despite the men around her sort of desiring her, partly for her, obviously for her wealth. And in actual fact, I've never thought about it before, but she's a bit of a Penelope figure from the Odyssey, really, fending off suitors and so on. Anyway, it's not exactly a love triangle, really. There's a triangle with Bathsheba in the middle. So there's Gabriel Oak, who, as his name suggests, very dependable man. And then there is a guy called Boldwood, and then there's dashing Sergeant Troy, and some of the scenes with him. There's an encounter between him and Bathsheba when they're on their own in the middle of nowhere, and it's one of my favourite scenes in literature, I think. So, you know, this kind of triangle evolves around Bathsheba, and of course it's the outcome, you know, which of these three men should she marry, and yeah, so, you know, absolutely, I think, rollicking read. Don't be put off by the length, just luxuriate in it, because it frustrates me, you know, novels on the whole these days tend to be quite short, and sometimes it's lovely to be immersed in this whole sort of cosmos within a novel. My absolute favourite Thomas Hardy, I know I've talked about this before, is Return of the Native. I love it, but I don't think I would read it as a first Hardy. I think you sort of almost need to embrace his style and sort of familiarise yourself with the world that he's describing, that sort of rural existence, quite harsh, well, very harsh existence, in you know, Victorian Dorset / Wessex. But I love this because I love the character of Eustacia Fry. She's so passionate and feisty, and what's the word? She's just really, she wants so much out of life, and because of the relationships she's formed, she's thwarted and frustrated, and so that this is another wonderful novel, but I would leave it until you'd read a few others of his. And then I remember my mum buying me Mill on the Floss, and I read it again as an adult and really enjoyed it, but I found that quite tough going as a child. I don't know why. But what I did love, and you can't even, I don't think there's even a title on the front of this now, but you might be able to see the lovely spine. This is an old school edition, I think, of Silas Marner by George Elliot, who of course wasn't George at all. She was Mary. Oh my goodness, I've forgotten her name. Old age is a terrible thing, isn't it? No, it's not. It's a wonderful thing. Don't be fooled. It's fun, or it can be. But anyway, Silas Marner is just a beautiful, it's almost like a sort of parable, really. And Silas Marner is a weaver. He is accused of a theft that he doesn't commit, and he's in this kind of religious circle or religious community, and he gets kicked out, sort of ostracized, because they think that he's stolen his stuff, and he ends up living a very, very lonely existence. He just commits himself to weaving, basically, and making as much money as he possibly can, and that's the way he kind of compensates for his loneliness. So he gets this huge stash of money, and counts it every night, and so on, and then eventually the money is stolen from him. But sometime later, in fact, is it sometime later? It could be the next day. I can't quite remember. But a little girl turns up in his house, and her mother's died, and she's wandered into the house, and he's actually having a fit at the time. He's cataleptic, so he's not aware of it. And so he wakes and finds this young girl and kind of adopts her and takes her under his wing. And it's his kind of sort of slow reintegration into humanity, really, and the way that this young girl kind of thaws his heart. It's a lovely, lovely, beautifully told story by George Eliot. But my favourite George Eliot novel is Middlemarch. And again, it's a lovely old hardback version that I've got there, again by George Eliot. And this tells the story of, lots and lots of different characters. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I love it so much, is, again, there's a whole, I think that's something that's true of a lot of Victorian novels, that you've got a really rich cast of characters from all different walks of life in this novel. And this novel sort of questions what a woman should do in terms of marriage. So you've got this young woman called Dorothea. I think she's only about 19, and she's faced with this decision about who she should marry. And it leads her to Switzerland. It leads her to a doomed marriage. She ends up in some really interesting places, but it's not just her story. It's also the story of other people who are searching for the sort of ideal marriage of the time, or maybe starting to question what that means. When her first husband dies, in his will he stipulates that she mustn't, if she remarries, it mustn't be to a certain man, and also that she needs to kind of stick to his standards. So it raises all sorts of questions about inheritance and who, the right of a man to dictate a woman's future. And clearly George Eliot is querying all of that. There's also lots of sort of questioning about religion and religious attitudes. So it's very kind of forward thinking, and it's funny as well. It's not just, you know, that there's humour in this novel. It's wry and it's so cleverly observed, the characters. I absolutely adore it. And from there, I think I sort of started to look at some foreign, as in, you know, mainly French actually, literature, French Victorian literature, because I was really interested in what was happening, you know, what the English were doing. But I also knew there were, or probably my mum actually pointed me towards French Victorian novelists. So this is Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. I was going to say Madame Flaubert by Gustave Bovary, but that would be wrong. Madame Bovary, and it's such a tragic tale, and I don't know whether, I mean, I did listen to it not that long ago and still quite enjoyed it, but I found it maybe a bit too sentimental, as, you know, my 56-year-old self. But you know, when I was sort of really enjoying discovering all this Victorian literature, I know I really loved it. And Emma Bovary, she doesn't start off as Emma Bovary, but she has, you know, several different marriages, doesn't get it right. She's very sort of materialistic in the sense that she likes fine things, and she's really, really dissatisfied in her relationships, and she gets to the point where she's going to run away and have an affair, and well, she does have an affair, in fact she has several, and again it's kind of exploring the consequences of any kind of freedom or free choice for women, and the devastating impact that has, because it is devastating for her. And, you know, the vast majority of these novels are really tragic. And I make no apology for that. I like a good tragedy, you know, because it's cathartic, isn't it, reading these things? And also I think it sort of helps you to feel that, you know, when you're experiencing really difficult times, it's quite humbling to realise that you know, throughout the centuries people have found life a struggle, but also found it very rich too. So yeah, I did really enjoy this when I was younger. And then again, sort of while I was exploring Flaubert, I also discovered Emile Zola. Now, I know he's quite controversial because he's quite sensationalist in his writing, but I love his scene painting. This novel, The Beast in Man, or La Bête Humaine, is it takes place, a lot of the novel does, as the cover would suggest, alongside a train line, and obviously, you know, during the Victorian era, trains were a relatively new form of transport, and so you've got these trains thundering up and down these tracks all the way through the novel. It's so atmospheric. He can build atmosphere beautifully, and it's a murder story, it's a psychological thriller, it's dark and unpleasant. You know, that there are, you know, I need to alert you to the fact that there is a child who is molested, you know, that kind of thing. It's very gothic in some ways, but what he's doing, I think, is looking at, in a similar way to Stevenson with Jekyll and Hyde, really, he's looking at, you know, how thin the veneer is on our humanity. You know, we think of ourselves as such civilized human beings, and certainly, you know, the Victorians did. They were going around civilizing the rest of the world, in inverted commas, weren't they? But he exposes the fact that underneath it all, we are still animals, and that's a theme that runs throughout, you know, literature, isn't it? Really, that whole. I mean, you can go back to Greek tragedy, and you see that theme, that whole sort of tug of war between the rational and the irrational side of humanity, and I think Zola explores that really well. There's a shorter novel called Thérèse Raquin, which I was going to talk about, but didn't, because it is unremittingly dark. But I think Zola is trying to plunge us into the, some people's lives are, and we should be, I suppose, aware of that. So yeah, I find his storytelling fascinating, and I've only read, I think, 3 or 4 of his novels, and really enjoyed all of them. But it's very rich. It's like really rich chocolate. You don't want to eat it too often. So I've kind of spun them out, and I'm sure before too long I'll be picking up another one. Now, of course, probably the most famous Victorian novelist, excuse me, disgraceful, certainly English Victorian novelist would be Dickens. And I have a really mixed relationship with Dickens, because there are certain novels which I absolutely love. I love Great Expectations. I love Tale of Two Cities. But there are other novels like The Old Curiosity Shop, which I just leaves me cold. I just find it overly sentimental. And also there are many of his novels that I've yet to read, and I am genuinely looking forward to doing that at some point. But my absolute favourite Dickens, and actually I think I'm right in saying it's his shortest novel, is Hard Times. And I only came across this because as a teacher, sometimes you have to pick up on what somebody else has left behind. So a colleague of mine had taught this to a year 12, lower 6, whatever. These are, for those of you elsewhere in the world, that means they're 16, 17-year-olds. And in our education system, we teach them for 2 years for their A-level certificates, which they then need to go on to university. And this colleague of mine had taught the novel. So I then, the following, because he left or changed groups, can't quite remember, but I then had to pick the novel up and teach it. I'd never read it, so I had to, happily, I mean, I love doing that kind of thing. Read it over the summer holidays, and I was a little bit, Dickens, I'm not sure. But my goodness, did he do me a favour, because it's a wonderful story. And I suppose one of the reasons I love it is because it does focus on the idea of education. But it's also about that conflict between, what matters more, sort of working and education and improving yourself and production. As in industrial production and industrial progress, or entertainment, because there's also the novel focuses on the world of the circus as well. So the novel starts in the school, and it's a Victorian schoolroom, and Mr. Gradgrind is putting the students through their paces. He's checking on their education, and there's a young girl from the circus called Sissy, and he sort of queries her, and he's very unhappy with her definition of what a horse is. And yet she rides horses at the circus. She definitely knows what a horse is. And all Mr. Gradgrind wants is facts. He wants to know, that a horse is graminivorous and it's got so many teeth and it's got this, that and the other, whereas Sissy is interested in it as a living, breathing, performing animal. So Dickens straight away sucked me in with the character of Gradgrind. There's also a fantastic self-made man called Bounderby, who's absolutely gruesome. You could just imagine being with in a room with him. He's really repellent, has some very horrific views, and the story revolves around his daughter as well, Louisa, and her future. But also there's a slant of the plot that takes you into the world of sort of mining, and Stephen Blackpool, who's a young, he's not young, I don't know, is he? I'm trying to think. I sort of imagine him being about 30, but I don't know whether he was. And he's a man who's trapped in a marriage, which again is a different angle, because his wife is a drunk, and he wants to try and extricate himself from this marriage, and it's really difficult because, of course, it's Victorian society. So yeah, and there's a good plot as well. The plot sort of bounces along quite nicely too, and quite a sort of dramatic third. It's written in 3 parts. So the third part is very dramatic when everything sort of comes together. So yeah, no, I really thoroughly recommend Hard Times. And then finally, I couldn't leave behind Victorian novels without talking about Trollope. Now, I am reading my way through Trollope very, very slowly. In fact, I almost feel I should start all over again. This one is the first of his Palliser novels. I think there are 6 of them. And it's interesting, isn't it, how the same sort of themes keep cropping up in these novels. Because although they're written, many of them by men, they're still exploring clearly, you know, the issues of marriage and relationships. So in this novel, there are 3 women, all of whom are on the point of marriage. One of them's a widow, so she's been married before and she's got 2 men in pursuit of her. Then there's, I think she's called Alice, who's got a very sort of stable man called John Gray, but he's stable and he's a bit dull and, you know, dependable. And then there's another guy called George who wants to be an MP. He's very ambitious, and she's sort of trying to make her mind up between those 2. And then there's the very wealthy Lady Glencora, who ends up attached to Plantagenet Palliser, and it's her story and Plantagenet's that's then taken through to the rest of the novels. And you know, I think Trollope genuinely was sort of asking questions about what women should do with their lives and what the purpose of their lives was. And the thing about Trollope that I absolutely love is that it's all quite satirical. So, you know, he's really wryly looking at the Victorian morals, attitudes, hypocrisy, status, etc., etc., and is thoroughly entertaining. And again, you just get immersed in this completely different world. So there you go. For those of you who've you know, were well versed in Victorian literature, you might not have found this particularly helpful, although there might be 1 or 2 books that perhaps you hadn't thought about reading. But certainly, I think if you're sort of a novice, and actually, it was partly thanks to I think it's Deborah Reed's things or Deborah Reed's books. That's awful. I'll try and credit her at the end. But I watched a YouTube video of hers where she was trying to looking at ways to get into Victorian literature, and she'd sort of chosen some that she was going to read, and it really made me think, you know, which ones would I choose to recommend to people who perhaps weren't familiar with Victorian literature. So there you go. Thanks, Deborah. Anyway, take care. That's it for now. I've had an absolutely amazing reading month. I can't wait to share that with you. So hopefully that'll be next week. I'll do a June wrap up because I've got some stonking books to share. There's one that I'm reading at the moment. I literally cannot put it down, but I'm not going to give any spoilers. Nearly stuck my finger up my nose then. That wouldn't have been good. Anyway, take care, everybody. Bye.